I was also a PESO alumna. So I was in third year high school. I wanted to have a summer job. Walk-in lang ako. Parang sa may provincial office pa yan ng Batangas. And then, of course, from that time, they couldn't find a regular employment, regular office. They offered me to sell Schiaparelli yung alahas networking business. At any rate, I said I wasn't good in doing that. But since DOLE in this particular program was giving certain percentage of income. So meaning that as long as I'm registered and if I could sell and then eventually I'll get certain percentage of my compensation would be paid by DOLE, which I was so happy because I used the money to buy school supplies. Coming from a poor family, I grew up in Santa Clara, Batangas City. So I was a working student all my life. Kaya parang at that time, I know PESO already. I was a recipient of that particular program and I used the money to buy. Parang it was the year I had a new pair of shoes. Ang saya ng nakabili ka ng sapatos that would last for a year. Kasi diba, if you can afford a good quality of shoes, you don't need a mighty band. Lalo pa, I was studying at Pablo Borbon, so bumabaha doon. So kailangan maganda yung sapatos mo. So thank you for that particular program. And I actually stayed the entire forum because I wanted to learn more, although I read about the PESO law and then about the LMI. So for those who are working on LMI, that is really very important, especially in terms of data. So in my case, I have to make sure that every decision that I will be making or recommending is supported by data. I learned it when I studied in business school. If you cannot count it, it doesn't matter. So as long as you can count it and put it into numbers and then make sense of it, then you could say you can actually have an impact in whatever it is that you're doing. But for the purposes of time, alam ko lunch na. So baka medyo
No, attorney, you
nagugutom
can
na rin
take your
kayo.
time.
Okay. So when this topic was given to me, strengthening public governance in the new normal, I said, okay, I accept it and I'm very grateful because although I'm working for international organization at the moment, pandemic has actually brought me home. So I am working from here in my house at San Isidro. So imagine like I have an opportunity to discuss with you what is the importance of public governance and what is the concept of the new normal. But for purpose of disclaimer, although I work for UN and OECD, anything that I will be sharing with you is my personal insight, although the information came from the studies and papers published by these international organizations. And then, of course, the framework that I would like to discuss this particular topic is first, we need to have a timeline. We need to understand what is happening in the global scenario. And the best way for me to introduce public governance and some strategies that are actually being advocated by organizations such as OECD is for us to understand at least 3 time zones. First is the 2015, and the 2030. So if you're going to be asked, what is the importance of these 2 years? We all know that they are very important in terms of sustainable development. So alam naman siguro natin what sustainable development is. It is actually when we think of addressing our needs, yet at the same time, we have to make sure that the needs of the future generation are also met. So hindi lang para sa atin ngayon, kundi the next generation. And then 2015 is very significant. Why? Because it was the year when the 2013 Sustainable Development Agenda was adopted by the United Nations. So basically, before 2015, I was part of a community-based organization in our country. I was working for fish operators in Taal Lake, and I was trying to put our fish cage operation in the limelight of sustainable aquaculture. So that was the project that I brought in Washington, D.C. in 2014. bringing the plight of our fish cage operators. Because if you will remember, sometime in 2012, there was a ano ba to? Petition for writ of kalikasan. They wanted to remove the fish cages. So I was the counsel who represented the fish cage industry, meaning that you don't remove the industry, you help them to become sustainable. Because if you remove the fish cages, what alternative livelihood are you going to give? So instead of removing them, teach them how to do it sustainably. So that was the work. And then from there, realize that there is such thing as what? The Sustainable Development Goal. So, and then since then, I started to work on different organizations to make sure that our communities here in Batangas, if not necessarily in the Philippines, because I am not really very active in terms of national issues, all the issues that I was bringing and have been bringing even until now are issues that are based here in our community. So, yun importante. So, 2015, yun na yung pinag-uusapan. And then, something happened in 2020, the pandemic. And then, of course, we should not focus or lose our focus on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal. So, that is the framework that I would like us to work in understanding what is public governance, how do we strengthen it, and what is a new normal? Or is it really a new normal? And then, of course, we'll try to deep down in terms of our agency. And, of course, you as part of the PESO. Basically, I want you to think like, how can I be a PESO champion? So again, I discussed it with you, the challenges. The first framework that we have to understand is what are the challenges that we had before 2015, which I called pre-2020. And during the pandemic, the 2020, some are saying that the pandemic is over because we are now in the post-pandemic, so we are more focused on our recovery. But others says that as long as there's still an increased number of infections, so we are still in the pandemic. That's why 2020 till what year? And then, of course, we have to prepare for the post-pandemic scenario. And at any rate, let's see. Pre-2015, what are our challenges? Of course, by book, we have read about the 2018 financial crisis. And of course, this affected the US, specifically in terms of housing. Ito yung scenario na may mga bubbles sa mortgage. So, affected ba nito ang countries like us? Of course. Why? Because we know that the US is one of the biggest economy, and then whatever happens in the US, meron siyang butterfly effect dito sa atin, hindi ba? And then of course, what? We are also affected by fuel prices. So basically, this is what the challenges in 2000 or prior to 2015. And then we had climate change. Climate change is, we all know, we are the most susceptible country. So we had experienced Yolanda, we had experienced worse typhoons, and then of course, it has also again a boomerang on our economic situation. And then aside from that, we have historical governance problems. So meaning that if you will look at our history, these issues on corruption, red tapes, inefficient spending, lacks of skills, these are historical. So these are the problems that we had pre-2015. But when we look at 2020, what happened? What happened with our global issues? Here, COVID-19 has actually sunk our economy 10%, which is even worse than the 2018 financial crisis. This is in March 2020. So if you're going to look at 2015, pre-2015, we're affected by the 2008 financial crisis. And then here, economists were saying that the pandemic has effect, or pandemic effects is even worse than 28 financial crisis. So imagine the trouble that we are actually facing. And then the second, again, climate change. Even the president recognizes that our vulnerability. So just look at the scenario last year. Imagine there was a eruption of the volcano, and then we have the pandemic, and then just weeks ago, there was also again some report that there might be eruption of the Taal volcano. So imagine our condition. And then of course, here, when you look at COVID-19, it is no longer considered as a crisis to health, but a governance crisis. Why? So many adjustments have been made in terms of policies. We have the Bayanihan Act, and one of the effect of the Bayanihan Act is what? Of course, changes in governance, more flexibility. Looking at the public procurement, which is the field of specialization that I am currently working. So if you see, some of the procurements are actually exempted from the public procurement law. So the issues now is like saying, how do we ensure that transparency, competition will still be there? So there will be questions on transparency. And then of course, the other one is still government failure. When we speak of government failure, our understanding is when the government actually what? Provided intervention in our economic activity. And then this intervention, according to some experts, actually has affected the distribution of resources. So say, for example, how does this affect during the time of pandemic? Imagine when the supply chain was disrupted. So where are we going to get the PPEs? So that's why at that time, there are so many health workers that were at risk. So even now, we have a question of what? Of availability of vaccines. So ako nga, I wanted to have like a chance to be vaccinated. But then when I look at the scenario, I say, okay, I am not among the priority persons that will be given the vaccine. So am I thinking of going back to Europe because most probably I will have more chance of having the vaccine there. So at any rate, these are the problems that we are facing at the moment, which if you will look at our scenario pre-2015 and now 2020 pandemic time, so question that we are facing is that, are the worsening condition the new normal? So is that the new normal? We are not improving. But then of course, if you will be asking me and our perspective should be, it should not be. So what is the new normal? So maybe we have heard of the word new normal only last year when the pandemic has affected us. But actually, the term new normal is not a new term. As early as 2018, UNEP has already introduced the new normal. It was introduced as a way of encouraging people to change their lifestyle to become more sustainable, but particularly focused on SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production, and then promoting circular economy. So if you look at SDGs, it's more on SDG 12, encouraging people what? To make sure that our consumption has the least inputs of resources. So circular economy is what? Making sure that we have least waste. We have to create an economy of zero waste. Why? Because we have to think of the next generation. If we're going to consume all our natural resources, what will be left to the next generation? So as early as 2018, we have been calling for a new normal. But if you look at who is the prime mover in terms of this call, this is actually a call to private sectors to change their operation and the way they do business. Because if we're going to continue the business as usual of using so many raw resources, then we are actually what? Putting an unsustainable future because our resources are finite. And then come 2020, the new normal has been highlighted by this time, but this time is the World Health Organization. And if you think of new normal, when before we are here thinking about sustainable lifestyle, how to recycle, reduce, and reuse, now we are thinking of staying safe, more on restriction. How can I protect myself? How can I be distance from people? And then you have to avoid crowded, close contact. It's like new normal is giving us this negative impression. when in fact, new normal is encouraging us to change our lifestyle so that we can actually prepare for a sustainable future. And this time, if you will look, it's a top-down approach. All the policies, even the businesses, are affected by what the public authorities are saying. So when they say closed the operation of small, medium enterprises, then the government had to do it. And then the question is, what about the work? So now the government had to intervene and provide amelioration support. So basically, the question now that we have to think is, if the new normal is not really new in terms of its introduction in the global development arena, our question should be, what is the next normal? What should be a better normal? A better normal that addresses the call for a most sustainable lifestyle, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we are protecting ourselves. But in the protection, because sometimes there's a conception that when we think of protection or protecting ourselves, we try to what? To remove ourselves from the community, which is, of course, that should not be the case because we cannot do it alone. So our concept right now is what should be the better normal. And of course, the better normal is if we will continue to work for what we have actually envisioned as early as 2015, the accomplishment of Sustainable Development Goals. For DOLE, of course, it would be what? SDG number 8, decent work. And imagine all of these Sustainable Development Goals are actually what? Aimed in addressing poverty, providing peace, safeguarding rights, protecting people, protecting the planet. So meaning that when we think of new normal, we should think of what? A better normal, of thinking on how we as an organization can help in the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the first thing is, of course, for us to understand what is the SDG. Of course, this is not part of my topic, but I'm suggesting that for future training, I think DOLE, PESO should concentrate also on the understanding of SDG 8, because I think that is the SDG that would really help the organization to contribute in what? Fulfilling our dream of a better normal. And then, of course, has any one of you read of the Philippine Development Plan of 2017 and 2022? Because if you are part of the government, I think the first thing that you should do is what is the national policy and what is the national plan. In my case, I have been reading all the Philippine Development Plans since as early as 2014. Why? Because when I was working as early as 2010 rather, when I was working at Batangas State University, if I want to have the projects that I was assigned to have national budget, to have relevance, then I have to make sure that it is aligned with the National Development Plan. In fact, when I was with Batangas State University, one of my favorite roles was to be the representative of the university to the Regional Competitiveness Council. Because there is the opportunity for me to connect with all the different agencies so that I had to make sure that what we are doing with the universities are aligned with what the region at that time needed. And then actually I learned pivot table at that time from the Regional Competitiveness Council. So when they were asking about employability, then I have to make sure the university would be part of the enumerator. I have to make sure that we had budget to support the regional line unit of the government on all its project because we are part of that. So in that case, if you will look at the scenario that I'm trying to say, we have a worsening scenario from 2015 to 2020. But we still have our goal. But the PDBs, actually, if you look at it, is 2040. Our development goal is up to 2040. And then it calls for matatag, maginhawa, at panatag na buhay para sa lahat. Actually, if you will read the entire plan, they opted not to translate that into English because it will develop a sense of ownership among Filipinos. Because according to our development agencies, they said, this is the dream of every Filipino. This is my dream. My dream is to have what? Matatag na buhay, maginhawa at panatag, peaceful. So in that case, what can the government do? And OECD, on our part, we have actually published just recently, on the last quarter of 2020, a framework for sound public governance. This will be to assist public institutions on how can we address the worsening conditions, the pre-2015 conditions that have worsened because of the pandemic. And of course, our main premise is to have a sound public governance. And then the question is, what is a sound public governance? There is actually a framework. The first thing is that do we have governance or policy instruments? So the first question that you will have to ask always is, do we have a law? Do we have a legal basis? Because if we don't have a law, it will be very difficult. It can be done, but it will be difficult. Say, for example, at the moment right now, I'm assisting two countries. One is in Moldova and the other one is in Georgia. Moldova has a law in terms of sustainable public procurement. Georgia doesn't have a law. So in that case, the first thing that we should do to make sure that we will be helping public contracting officials, those who are working on the bidding, to make sure that they can incorporate sustainability in the procurement is there is a law. So there is a law is very important. Otherwise, you have to be very creative, but it doesn't stop you there. So for example, when I was working for Batangas State University in the bidding, we all know that in the government bidding, we have to base it on low price criterion. So we had no choice but the low price criterion. But at that time, we knew that it shouldn't be the case. If we want quality, then it shouldn't be based on the price. So I remember defending a decision of the back based on academic freedom because we actually evaluated on quality. And then we were questioned. And then how did I defend? How did I defend the award of the back to quality-based? I use academic freedom. So in that case, imagine if we have already a law which says that the basis of the award is value for money, then it will be easier. So the first thing that you should do is in terms of promoting sustainable development goals is, do you have a law? If you look at the Public Employment Service Law, which was already discussed the first session, it is actually aligned with SDG 8. So it means that if you had the work, the goal of decent work, you already is supported by the law. And then the second is, do you have a budget? Because that is another question. Sometimes you have a law, but if the law doesn't provide for the budget, you are actually giving a law that will not work because you need to have a budget for that. Say, for example, in the case of Moldova, Moldova has a law on sustainable public procurement since 2015. I evaluated the implementation. It didn't work. Why? Because there was a gap on the budget policies. How can we promote sustainable procurement in their government if their budgetary process is still restricted by fiscal year? And you know, sustainability requires life cycle costing. So if you are not going to change your budgetary rule, there's no way that you can incorporate life cycle costing. So in that case, you have to check also on the budget. So if there is no budget, even if there is a law, then you will have a problem. And when I look at it, you have two sources of budget, the LGU in terms of IRA, and of course, the DOLE GAA. So I think from there, you can actually maximize what you can do. And then the second thing that you have to analyze on how to make sure that your governance will be strengthened to address a better normal of achieving or at least contributing, if not on the sustainable development goals, because sometimes we think it's too global. You just look at what? At the Philippine Development Plan. Or look at this like, how can I help achieve a Filipino goal of matatag, maginhawa, at mapayapang buhay? Yun lang, hindi ba? And then you have to make sure you have the sufficient tools. First, strategic planning on terms of public service. And of course, when you do strategic planning, that is well, LMI is very, very important. You have to have data. Actually, when I was looking at it and I was thinking, so if I will be knowing the percentage rate of unemployment and underemployment, and as I am part of the PESO, my goal is what? How can I what? Change the rate, increase the employment and decrease the unemployment. That should be my personal goal. I want to know it and I want to understand that particular number because my goal, personal goal, if that is allowed and it should be allowed, is the what can I do to help my agency that in the next quarters or years, these numbers will change and improved. So that is the importance of knowing some data so that at the end of the day, when you have particular regulations, you have to make it operational. And then of course, the question of digital government. I checked the website of PESO. The importance of service is again, you have Citizens Charter. I love Citizens Charter. When it was first introduced in our country, I was the head of the ARTA team for Batangas State University. So I actually wrote the first Citizens Charter for BSU. So it made me understand what the dynamics on how we can improve our service. Now, the question right now is you have so many services. Have you actually tried to think of reevaluating your Citizens Charter? Why? Because it's very rare that people will go to your office right now because of the social distancing and the restriction. So might as well try to evaluate your Citizens Charter to make use, to make sure that the services there will be available online and change the platform. Otherwise, you have here good services, but you have a disconnect with the people. And then of course, because we are still part of the government, you know that public procurement is a very important tool. Why? Because actually you can help small, medium enterprises to get public contracts. So if that is the case, I mean, DOLE, PESO, you buy things, right? So if you are buying, of course, I know the limitations of the procurement law. That's why I have been working with some of the government agencies here on how we can actually, what do you call this? Improve our public procurement regulations. But the law allows certain agency to create its own implementing regulations. So if you want to make sure that you will use public procurement as a leverage, DOLE or PESO can actually facilitate of coming up of its internal implementing rules and regulations in terms of public procurement, where you can actually set aside a certain amount of your procurement budget for what? For small, medium enterprises, for women organizations. So in that case, you are actually promoting decent employment using your public budget. And then of course, why is LMI very important? I think Iris has been discussing it in her talk, is we need to monitor and evaluate. We need numbers. We have to make sure that we are actually counting our beneficiaries. We are actually monitoring. Are we actually improving? Are we really helping the people to get what? Decent employment? So these are the tools that we have to consider if we have to make sure that our agency will remain relevant in addressing the challenges that we have faced since 2015 and have actually worsened due to pandemic. And at the end of the day, if we have all of these policies and tools, it will always be a question of our values. Our values. So what do we as an organization advocate in terms of service? And these are the basic values that OECD and other international organizations are advocating. The first is really integrity. Because if you are working for the government and you have a question, there is a question on your integrity, there will always be a trust issue. It's a trust issue. When I was working for the government, I only have one criterion in terms of integrity, and that is what? Fairness. So every time I'm asked to make a decision, and I have to think of two extreme scenarios, it's always be two extremes. The person I cannot say no, and the person that I really didn't like for no reason at all. As human being, we have that particular idiosyncrasies. You cannot say that you didn't happen at one time in your life, a certain experience that you didn't like a person, even for a particular reason or no reason at all. So when you have to make a decision representing your office, that is the moral compass that I had. If the decision or the request came from the person I cannot say no to, for example, my mother, will I say yes or no? Of course, yes, because it's my mother. And then I think, if that is the person that I really didn't like, will I say yes or no? Sometimes you would say no, because I didn't like. So you have to balance. And in that case, you remove all your idiosyncrasies and you decide objectively, irrespective of who the person is. So even if it is my mother, if it is not right, I would say no, because it's not a good manifestation of integrity if I said yes to my mother and no to that person. So it will now be depending on what? On who the person asking is, and not really on a policy-based decision. So you have to make sure that whatever it is that you are doing as an organization, it should be based on integrity and fairness. And of course, this should be coupled with all other values such as openness and transparency. Inclusiveness is, of course, you have to check that no one is left behind. Say, for example, that is actually one of the values that I had or have been doing. So whenever there is a person entering my office, the first thing that I would do is approach the person and ask. I didn't have to ask the frontline person to entertain. So when I am out in the receiving area, I had to make sure that I would be the one to actually entertain the person, even if it wasn't part of my job. Why? Because that is actually a proof that I'm showing that everyone is welcome. And that will be what? Inculcated also by my staff. And of course, the other values is participation in terms of what? You have to make sure there was a question that, I'm working on PESO and then there is a livelihood office. The best thing that you could do is actually work with that livelihood office. And then make sure that your work is actually complementary with the work of the other office. It doesn't matter who let's say, for example, sometimes our issue is in terms of accomplishment. In terms of accomplishment, this is some of the issues in governance. In my case, there is an old saying, imagine what you can do if you will not be thinking who gets the credit. So in my case, even if my complementary work with another agency will make that agency more valuable than mine, it's okay. As long as what I did would help the people, the clients that we are working, to what? To have a better opportunity. Say, for example, this is a small, medium enterprises and they need what? Assistance, livelihood, and technical. Imagine if you are also assisting that particular SME soon. That SME may ask for a staff, and then, of course, it can actually refer to PESO. So in that case, when you look at the values, you have to make sure that you are not disconnected with the other organizations. That's why, I mean, I am actually recommending, if it is, that you should ask your supervisors if you could sit in any local competitiveness council. Why? Because that will give you an opportunity to see what is happening in the other government agencies and how you can work with those agencies to make sure that you are actually what? Giving the best possible service to your client. And then gender equality, it's actually, I've seen that there is a small gap between male and female. But at any rate, if you look at work disruption, we still have some issues on female employment in terms of wage differences. I don't know how it is here in our region, but I've seen in other countries that there is really a wide gap in terms of compensation between male and female. And diversity, of course, is very important in terms of values, because here hatred comes from not being able to accept diversity. So if you look at social media, sometimes, I don't get to look at the social media because it gives you so much hatred. When in fact, the best way for us to move forward is to accept the simple, what do you call this? Simple principle that I may not agree with what you say, but I will definitely defend your right to say it. So that is what diversity is, not necessarily agreeing, but actually respecting. And then, of course, we're all part of the government, and then we should be accountable. Accountable in what sense? I remember sometime when I was part of the government and I was advocating for the payment of overtime pay. So we all know, we all part. I've seen in the profile that some of you have been working for more than 10 years. So you might have experienced that compulsory time off. So I was asking my staff to work overtime because we had so many deliverables, and then suddenly I couldn't pay their overtime, and then I had to ask them, and then they had to ask for leave, but I couldn't afford their leave. Why? Because we had so much work. So it's like I was asking them to work overtime, and I was disapproving their application for leave, and I wasn't paying them. So that is what a very a very manifestation of unfairness. So what I did is I really fought on how overtime should be included in our CNA, and they should be paid at the end of the year. And what happened at that time is, of course, some of the officials were not really comfortable in signing vouchers. So in that case, I signed the vouchers. So I asked them, okay, if I would go to jail because I paid those people who worked and did deliver something, I don't mind. Why? Because I am accountable to make sure that my team was protected in terms of rights. Because I know that if this case will go to the Supreme Court, I will defend that they are entitled for the payment of overtime pay. So it's more on accountability. And why am I accountable? Because I know that my decision wasn't personal. It's about helping my people. My first stakeholder, my first client is my employees, my staff. So if I couldn't protect their rights, how can I protect the rights of other people who are going to our office for public services? So your first client is actually your staff. And then, of course, we have to make sure we follow the law, because again, as part of governance, we don't have the flexibility compared to private sector. Imagine when I was part of the government, I had like 10 cases, administrative cases filed against my president, who was then Dr. Magnaye, and I was correspondent. So we were like doing our best to make sure that we are making a difference in Batangas State University, and we had numerous administrative cases. But because we know that we didn't do anything that is against the law, and thus we just considered those administrative cases as ways to prevent us from doing what we are doing of helping the university and the people, we fought. And then, of course, all of those cases were already dismissed, although, of course, it took time. So at any rate, when you have these values with you, that's why it's important that you have trainings for you to know the law, so that you will know the very basic tool that you have to protect yourself. And then you are supported with all of these values, and your management have these tools, then we could say that we are almost there. But then, of course, the last is we have to have, the enabler. The enabler is what? That would help us actually make sense of the policies, the tools, and our values. And these enablers are what? First, the very important is the commitment. Commitment of our regional director, at least. Because I remember one of my mentors told me when I was actually proposing some systemic changes, the question is, does the head of the agency support your ideas? And when I said no, and then he said, forget about it. So if you do not have the support of the head of the agency, it will be very, very difficult to implement systemic changes. So the enablers must be the commitment. And of course, you have to make sure, that is why LMI is important. You have to be supported by evidence. And then you have to coordinate with other government agencies, because you cannot do it alone. Integration with other agencies is very important. And then lastly, you have to think. You have to think of yourself as part of the agency. Whenever I am, I always think of how can I be a champion. And the champion doesn't mean that you will be recognized. The champion is that you are making a difference in whatever it is that you are doing. And then, of course, of all the values, there are so many. You can just choose 3. Just choosing 3 and then practicing it every day can make you a champion. The very important value that you shouldn't miss is integrity. You have to know the law, and inclusiveness. Inclusiveness allows you to respect other people. And then you have to be innovative. Some said you have to think outside the box. No, innovation says there is no box. So you have to think now that there is no box, there is no limitation. Let me just cite one very recent example that I had during pandemic. When the COVID had affected Italy, we were the first country. I was in Italy at the time. Actually, it was at the time when we were locked down. I was like, yay, I will be able to finish my thesis because I have been requesting for work from home and it was denied. And then suddenly the lockdown and say, okay, I will be working from home. And then I received so many messages from the migrants saying, we want to go home, we want to go home, we want to go home. They asked Polo Milan, they asked Polo Rome, and they said repatriation is not possible in the country because the OFW there are permanent resident. And then they were looking at OWA law. OWA law is, speaking of repatriation, charged against the employer or the agency. And since they are permanent residents, they don't have employer representative in the country. So the OWA law does not actually apply in terms of repatriation. And then people were messaging me saying, we want to go home. They were crying. And then, of course, what do I do? When I check on the OWA law, I said, it's not possible. You have to think of other means. I look at the Migrants Act, and then I use that particular provision on assistance to national. I made a petition directly to the president. through the office of secretary, and then I did it using the administrative procedures, so making sure that my pleading is correct and compliant in substance and form, because I was thinking that if the president would deny the petition, I would go to Supreme Court and question it. But lo and behold, networking's help, people that in government helped me with that petition. And then in less than 1 month, the government sent an airplane and 87 migrants or Filipinos that are distressed at the time were brought to the Philippines. And that was the first repatriation that wasn't charged or wasn't based on OWA Act. So you have to what? To think outside the box. If I just said, okay, I was looking for exemption to the OWA Act, and there's no way I could defend it. And I look at the Philippine Constitution, I look at other laws, and I was able to find a legal basis to ask for immediate repatriation of the Filipinos, and we were able to do it. And then the last, which is very important, you have to be a team player. But a team player doesn't mean you have to say yes all the time. The best team player is the one who can say no without creating an enemy. Because at the end of the day, you always have to check that the values that you have and tell yourself that what a champion can compromise details, but never your values. Because values will make you a champion, not necessarily the head of the agency. You don't need to be the head of the agency to be the champion. You can be a PESO champion to the very person coming to your office. You can be a PESO champion to the employer asking help, and to that particular girl from Santa Clara, slum area, walking into your office without knowing anybody and saying, I heard that you have a summer job. Can you help me? I still remember the face of that person, the woman, short hair, old person. And of course, she said, the only available is for you to sell chaparelli. But she didn't discourage me. She said, just do it because DOLE had a fund for you. And in that case, I actually realized one thing. I'm not good in networking. I sold this jewelries to all my relatives, removing my commission. Because I'm not interested in the commission. I'm interested with that amount that DOLE had for me after that program. So in any case, for you, for me, at the end of the day, what I want you to realize that there are so many problems that we are facing right now, country problems, local problems. You just have to think of what I can do as a PESO representative and how can I be a champion to every person that is coming into my office. And in that case, you are actually what? Strengthening governance, and you are doing it not for the new normal, but for a better normal. Thank you so much. If you want to learn more, I gave there the references of all the materials that I had.
Thank you so much po, Attorney Molino, for sharing with us your competent knowledge and insights on strengthening public governance in the new normal. All right? As per Attorney Jellie, we will have a better normal if we strive to achieve what has been set before. And everyone, may we all accept Attorney Molino's challenge to be a PESO champion. Together, let us make a difference. Muli po, maraming salamat po, Attorney Molino.
Salamat din po.
At
Kung may tanong po kayo, pwede po kayong magtanong.
Yes po. Thank you po, Attorney. At this point, I will be giving the virtual floor to Mr. Vincent M. Alcantara to conduct our open forum and to award the certificate to our speaker.
Thank you so much, Attorney Jellie Molino, for a very comprehensive discussion of public governance in the new normal. So sigurado ako na napakadaming key takeaways ang nakuha ng ating mga attendees for this session. And at this point, we will proceed to our open forum. ang dami mga comments and questions for Attorney Molino. So basahin natin. Yung una muna nating question. Dr. Molino, if you are to rank the values and the enablers, alin po ang dapat pinakamauna?
Okay. So first thing that we always answer, an answer that we always give is there's no such thing as fit for all. So I couldn't say that just because this is the value that works for me and the enabler that works for me, it will work in all circumstances. So it depends on the scenario where you are having. So you have to check. Say for example, like in my case at that time, when Dr. Magnay, I mean, you are all familiar who Dr. Magnay was. When Dr. Magnay asked me to be her executive assistant, I didn't say no, because we share the same values. So in that case, when Dr. Puted asked me to work with him in Pangasinan State University as an interim to assist him, because he came from a private university and then suddenly he will be administering a public university. Of course, the rules are different. And then he asked me, can you help me in a transition? I only have one particular request with Dr. Puted. We're gonna do a corrupt-free management. As long as you have to check the values of the organization that you are working, and then make sure that how can I actually complement and supplement the values. But again, if you look at the PESO champion, I have already answered that in the PESO champion. There are at least three. First, the very important is integrity. Integrity regardless of where you are, whether you be from the government, the NGO, work with NGO. I work with private sector as compliance officer. When private sector asked me to be a compliance officer, I had only two requirements. They will follow the law in terms of environmental compliance. Otherwise, I would say no. Even if you are going to pay me that high, I'm not going to accept it because I have uncompromisable principles. So integrity is very important. But then if you work for the government, you must study the rules. Why? Because it's not important for you to be a good person. Remember, all those good persons sometimes had faced so many legal battles simply because they were so naive in the sense that they were being used by people who know how to manipulate the regulations. So make sure that you will be person not susceptible of these particular abuses by making sure you stick with the rules. And then, of course, as mentioned, the one is inclusiveness. What is that? Accepting everyone. Otherwise, I mean, those three would be enough for you to make a difference. And then an enabler, I think I already answered that also. The first very important is commitment of the agency. Because you have this great idea to make a difference, and then when you are proposing it to supervisor, no, and then you will be demoralized. So if there is no political vision and commitment in your agency, I'm not saying you have to forget it. You just have to look at your specific role and then make sure you implement what you are proposing in your office. Say, let me give you an example. When I was a vice president of a university, do you know that I put my personal number in the help desk? I put my personal number. Why? Because I want to make sure that all complaints will come to me. Not because I have to know what is happening outside, but I want to make sure that I am connected with the people, even if I was already a VP. So that somebody would ask, bakit po dito sa cashier nagpe-Facebook? Akala ko po ba walang walang lunch break. So anong gawin ko? Tawag ako sa director. Sir, may nagpe-Facebook daw po dyan. Baka naman pwede, huwag niya iharap. Dapat joke lang ako. Joke ko sila. And then sometimes, when I wanted to implement the 3-ring rule policy, kasi sabi, bato walang sumasagot sa opisina ni Gando. So ang gagawin ko, ako yung tatawag. Sabi ko, sir, akala ko ba nag-implement tayo ng 3-ring rule policy? Hanggang napraning na silang lahat. Baka si attorney yan. hanggang nag-change mo yung habit ng mga tao. So you try to do it. I mean, in that case, I wanted I proposed to the executive committee the removal of Facebook. And then all the VPs said, no, we cannot have, wala na nga tayong maibigay na UHR policy on mental health. Aalsin pa natin ang Facebook. So lahat sila tutol sa akin. So ano ibig sabihin? If I can do it in a policy and a systemic base, I do it in my office, in the person, or I do it in myself, so that my staff will not say, bawal ang Facebook naman siya. Ano mo yun? So in that case, commitment is very important. It will be easier if you have the commitment of the agency or your head. It will be a smooth sailing. But if we don't have, it doesn't mean you can do it. Do it just by disciplining yourself. And I think you can make a difference in your table, in your window, and in the person you are dealing with.
Thank you, Attorney Jelly. We have another question here. Attorney, ano po ang isang country na na-visit or napag-aralan nyo na may magandang employment framework? Baka sakaling pwede po namin silipin para ma-adapt namin ang best practices of such country.
Actually, to be very honest, my work is not really on employment. My work is in public procurement, is on the bidding. But I studied the future of work. There's one thing you should also do. Try to find conferences and seminars. At the World Bank, if you will look at the World Bank course, they have so many courses on the future of work and decent living. These are available in EDX and they're for free, but you just have to what? To really go into the drill of reading and writing. So in that case, wala ka talagang masasabi, again, as you mentioned, it all depends on the scenario. You can't say that what is happening, for example, in the US will be applicable in the Philippines. Let's say, for example, in terms of question of providing assistance to small, medium enterprises in terms of government contracts. I was questioning the definition of small, medium enterprises. I was saying that in the US, small, medium enterprises, requirement nila is, I think, $2 million capital or 20 million, I forgot. So I said that if that small medium enterprise will compete with our country, and then we have an international law of setting aside certain percentage of the contract to small medium enterprise, and we have different definition of SMEs, then their SMEs will be our large companies already. So it all depends on the sector. And I say, for example, here, will you be questioning the question of Pacquiao system? Diba? So, may mga ganong scenario, or sa employment framework, one thing is very common among all of these framework is compliance with ILO convention. Prevention of what? Prevention of child labor, prevention of trafficking. I had one issue here in the Philippines. I was asked to review a contract of a Chinese corporation that was awarded a government contract, and then they had some issues on workforce that are coming to the Philippines without what? Specific labor compliance. So that is actually some of the issues that are related in my work in terms of employment. So we have to make sure that public contracts would not be used for trafficking. So I think respective, you have just to make sure that children will not be working on hazardous conditions. And then second, you have to prevent trafficking. You have to make sure that rights are protected. And then, of course, if you will look now at the scenario of the future of work is described as informal sectors and flexibility. That's why there was a question, paano yung mga halimbawa, will be considered now yung mga nagtitinda sa Facebook as employed? Di ba? Pag nag-ano ba kayo, paano siya itatakal? Ang dami kong mga kaibigan na gano'n. Mas malaki pang kinikita nila sa akin ngayon. Hindi ba? So in that case, even the World Bank and ILO, I should connect the DOLE with ILO ITC because I work for ILO ITC as visiting professor. There are so many programs there And actually, I was trying to connect with the Chamber of Commerce in Batangas on how we can actually bring some students in Batangas, in ILO, ITC, for a training on a possible internship for a UN organization. Hindi lang siya nag-work, dapat pala sa PESO ko siya pinasok, hindi sa chamber. So at any rate, wala talaga. But you have to make sure that international convention, national laws are in the framework.
Thank you, Attorney. Let us read some of the comments from our participants. Law and budget are the keys. Unfortunately, limited budget lang po kami, Attorney, dito sa LGU namin. Tapos from PESO Lipa.
Let me comment on that first para kasi
Yes,
importante yan. I worked with Batangas State University before. We didn't have budget. And you know what? One of the possible sources of budget is the private sector. But to be able to get funding from private sector, you need to have the integrity. Integrity in what way? Say, for example, imagine the problem that we face. Dr. Magnaye promised that we will not be having tuition fee increased. And then she said, we will be buying all the equipment. And then she said that we will be doing all the unfinished building. Where are we going to get the money? So what do? Scholarship. When we cannot find scholarship from the government, we look scholarship from the private sector, meaning that all of those students who couldn't afford to pay, somebody should pay their tuition fee because we need to raise money.
Okay, sige, basahin po natin yung ibang mga comments from our participants. From PESO Lipa, congratulations, Attorney Jellie Molino. We've learned a lot from you and the topic was very interesting and commendable. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and stay safe. There is no box. That's how an innovative thinker thinks. Ang solid po nito, Attorney. And Attorney Jellie Molino, good morning po. Thank you so much po sa inspiring, meaningful, be a PESO champion and makapusong presentasyon. I highly commend the speakers for 2 days training. That's from PESO Balete. We have here Attorney Jellie Molino, siksik, liglig at umaapaw po ang inyong discussion. Thanks po. And here are some of the key takeaways from PESO staff of Tanawan City. Be a PESO champion, be familiar with SDG and PDB, make sure that our PESO activities are aligned with the regional and national plans. Yan. And then we have here, walk the talk. I agree with Attorney that is what our leaders need. That's what we need. Of course, we have here from PESO Batangas City, Attorney, how to be you po. Hehe, on a side note, ang ganda po ng challenge nyo to be a PESO champion. And from Dr. Eve, Attorney Jellie, thank you so much. Being a PESO champion is having the capability to deliver sustainable employment for better normal.
But I guess, Sir Vincent, we just have to wait for, I think, attorney's back.
So at any rate, so what I was trying is, I know that budget is limited, but you know, that's actually a wrong notion. There are so many funds out there. You just need to have a good project. You can work with international organizations if you work with LGU. You can actually apply for grant. You can apply for, there are so many funds, believe me. In terms of COVID assistance internationally, you just need the right project. So if your LGU is interested, I may help you connect with some organizations because of getting funds for particular project. Kasi meron yan kung marunong ka magawa ng project proposal, na nandun lang yan makakakuha ka talaga ng grant. I know some LGUs who were able to get support from international organization and private sector. So yun, mas malaki, mas konti pa yung sa national government. If you have good projects and you know the networks and you have the skills to do project proposal, there is a big and enough funds for everyone. Just need to have a good project and the right competency to get those projects.